The green line on the radar screen draws a familiar and hypnotic lie, the same empty sky it has drawn for 1,000 hours. It is 1967 on the Kola Peninsula, a frozen edge of the Soviet Empire where boredom is a form of vigilance. But a single ghostly pulse arrives on the scope, a signal that proves the sky is not empty and that the rules of the world are about to be rewritten. It is cold enough to make sound reluctant. Here, in the Soviet far north, the air is thin and hard, and the winter landscape is an endless expanse of white that seems to absorb all noise and warmth. Inside the reinforced concrete bunker sunk deep into the frozen tundra, the world is a place of mechanical groans and human stillness. Pipes along the ceiling contract in the cold, groaning like old men shifting in their sleep. A clock with a cracked yellow face ticks with a rhythm that a man can understand. A steady, indifferent measure of time. The world moves forward whether he watches it or not. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Korolyov keeps his hands where they always seem to end up, resting on the cool, curved glass of the P-14 Tall King early warning radar screen. For months, his entire existence has been framed by this glowing green circle. He has watched that luminous line draw and redraw the same empty sea of sky, a slow, patient sweep that reveals nothing but the vastness of their northern frontier. He has learned how to read boredom the way a priest reads scripture, searching for hidden signs and omens in the static. His life is a collection of small, cold rituals. The coffee in his mug, brewed hours ago, has a thin ring of ice forming at its rim. The cigarette resting in the ashtray is a cold stick of memory, long since extinguished. The air in the bunker is thick with the smell of old electronics, damp wool, and the faint, lingering scent of cabbage from the mess hall. This is the front line of the Cold War, not a place of high drama, but of immense, soul-crushing monotony. At precisely 0900 hours, the rhythm breaks. It is not a dramatic arrival. There is no sudden, screaming alarm, no flashing red light. It is a subtle thing, a ghost that begins to flirt with the background noise of the display. Victor's eyes, trained by 1,000 hours of watching nothing, notice it instantly. It is a faint, inconsistent return, a dot that appears for one sweep and is gone the next. For a long moment, he tells himself it is a false return. It could be a flock of birds, a pocket of turbulent weather, or the occasional commercial flight straying slightly from its designated corridor. He has seen it all before. But this blip refuses to behave. It returns on the next sweep and the next, firming up from a ghost into a solid, undeniable point of light at the very edge of the scope, near the Norwegian border. Victor tightens his jaw, his fingers moving with a practiced economy. He slides the gain on the console, amplifying the signal, and watches the dot become sharper, clearer. Sector 4 to 7, he says, his voice quiet and steady in the hush of the control room. The headset is a loose, familiar thing, a simple wire that binds him to the rest of the vast Soviet air defense network. Altitude undetermined, speed recalculating. The men around him, long accustomed to the easy arrogance of daily routine, go quiet. The casual conversation about a hockey game, the rustle of a newspaper, it all stops. They turn their heads, their faces illuminated by the green glow of their own consoles, and watch Victor. They can feel the shift in the room, the sudden tightening of the air. The numbers from the calculating machine come back slow, as if the machine itself is arguing with him, checking and rechecking a result that it cannot believe. The operator reads them out, his voice flat with disbelief. The target is moving at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound. Victor gently taps the glass of the screen with his index finger, an involuntary human gesture, as if a single fingertip could physically check the universe for a mistake. In the year 1967, Mach 3 for a sustained maneuvering aircraft is not just a technological feat. It is an act of pure, distilled insolence. It is a violation of the known laws of aeronautics as they understand them. The bunker's commanding colonel arrives like a sudden, cold draft, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. He leans over Victor's shoulder, his presence radiating a sharp, controlled anxiety, until they both share the same square inch of quiet panic, their eyes fixed on the single, impossible dot. "Is it ballistic?" the colonel asks, his voice low. It is the question that haunts every man in this room, the fear of an incoming missile, the start of a war that would last only a few hours. Victor shakes his head, never taking his eyes off the screen. Negative, Comrade Colonel, not ballistic. The trajectory is level, it is maintaining altitude, and it is maneuvering. That last word hangs in the air, heavy and indigestible. A ballistic missile follows a predictable arc. This thing is being flown. It is under intelligent control. Outside the thick concrete walls of the bunker, the wind howls across the tundra, a white, howling language of its own. But inside, the world has shrunk to the size of this single room. Words are now typed onto forms, stamped with official seals, and handed to couriers. No one jokes, no one smiles. The easy boredom of the morning has been replaced by a focused, electric tension. A question has been asked of them, a question delivered from the stratosphere, and they have no answer. All they have is a single, glowing dot, moving with an arrogant speed across a map that was, just moments ago, blessedly, reassuringly empty. The initial shock of the detection solidifies into the cold, hard process of military response. A scramble order, encoded and urgent, ripples out from the command bunker. On a windswept airfield miles away, alarms blare, sending pilots and ground crews running across the frozen tarmac. 2 MiG-21 interceptors are vectored toward the last known coordinates of the intruder. These are slender, powerful beasts of Soviet speed, the very embodiment of the nation's design philosophy. Make it big, make it fast, and make it uncompromising. The MiG-21 is a pilot's aircraft, a challenging and unforgiving machine, essentially a massive engine with a small cockpit and swept-back wings attached. In the thin air of high altitude, it is a thoroughbred, capable of pushing past Mach 2. The pilots, encased in their pressurized suits, climb through the thinning, cobalt blue air, their afterburners spitting controlled fire. They are the tip of the spear, the human extension of the Red Army's will. Their radio calls come back in steady, clip bursts, the professional language of men who have trained their entire lives for this single moment. They push their machines to the absolute edge of the performance envelope, each passing minute a small percussive hammer on a brittle and finely tuned craft. But as they ascend, the mystery of their target only deepens. They are climbing into a world their aircraft was not truly designed to inhabit. At 80,000 feet, the MiG-21s become small, struggling problems set against a vast and profound mystery. The target, according to the ground controllers, is still above them. It is beyond their service ceiling in a place their wings cannot find enough air to grip, a place their engines struggle to breathe. Through their sun-dilated canopies, the Soviet pilots squint into a sky that has turned a dark, deep purple, a color that feels less like atmosphere and more like the cold, hard vacuum of outer space. The curvature of the earth is a visible, humbling arc beneath them. One of the pilots, straining his eyes against the glare, catches a glimpse of something. A silver streak, a brief, impossibly bright glint of reflected light, impossibly high above him. It is not the wavering, indistinct shape of a conventional aircraft. This object is serene, stable. It does not shake. It does not burn with the raw, incandescent fury of a rocket. It simply is. "We are losing it," one of the pilots says, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. His own machine is protesting, the controls feeling sluggish and unresponsive in the near void. They turn back, their mission a failure. Their engines, which had screamed in protest on the way up, now hum with a sullen, overworked rhythm. The warning lights on their instrument panels are a galaxy of crimson and amber, each one a small cry of mechanical pain. On the ground, in the warmth of the workshop, the maintenance crews will talk of choked compressors and turbine blades that have softened and warped from the extreme heat. But for now, the pilots are simply riding the slow, sickening descent back to Earth, the only place in which men and their fallible machines can be fixed. Back in the bunker, Viktor Korolyov watches the icons of the 2 MiGs turn back on his screen, their chase ending in futility. He tracks the intruder as it continues its unhurried, untouchable path across their northern frontier, eventually fading from his scope as it passes out of range. The sky is empty again. But the silence that returns to the room is different now. It is no longer the comfortable silence of routine. It is a heavy, questioning silence filled with the weight of an unanswered challenge. That night, when Victor files his official report, his fingers are steady, but his notes are stripped of all bravado and speculation. He writes only the hard, undeniable facts. He records the latitude and longitude, the heading, the speed. He writes what his instruments have told him, a craft flying at a sustained speed of Mach 3.2, at a constant altitude of 80,000 feet, and performing controlled maneuvers. He notes that the radar signature was not the bright, expanding bloom of a disintegrating meteor or a rocket stage in thermal failure, but an odd, stable, and remarkably small figure. He seals the report in a heavy manila envelope, stamps it with the highest security classification, and hands it to a courier. The courier is a young man with a serious face who takes the envelope and places it in a leather briefcase, which he then chains to his own wrist. This briefcase, containing the raw data of a profound technological mystery, will journey south by sleeper train, its contents unknown to the other passengers, a quiet secret traveling through the heart of the motherland. Victor watches the courier leave, and then returns to his screen, to the familiar green line that now seems to hold a new and unsettling promise. The ghost had come and gone, but the questions it left behind were just beginning to take shape. 48 hours after it left Viktor Korolyov's cold, concrete bunker, the leather briefcase arrives at its destination. It sits on a heavy, dark oak table in a room where equations live, and the smell of old paper and pipe tobacco has a tangible weight. This is the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, known by its Russian acronym TSAGI. It is the intellectual heart of Soviet aviation, the place where the nation's greatest aeronautical minds gather to solve the most complex problems of flight. The best minds in the Soviet Union now lean over the data tapes and the typed report from the Kola Peninsula, their faces etched with a mixture of intense curiosity and deep professional concern. They are like priests examining an omen, a strange and unsettling text delivered from the heavens, searching for a meaning that lies just beyond the edges of their known world. The room is a study in methodical, intellectual struggle. Graphs are drawn on large blackboards in precise, confident strokes of chalk, speed versus altitude versus thermal load. The data is laid bare, a riddle presented in the pure, cold language of mathematics. Theories are proposed, debated with a quiet, surgical speed, and then, one by one, discarded. It must be ballistic, someone suggests, because the old familiar fear of a nuclear missile is a comforting habit of thought. It is a known threat, a problem they understand. Impossible, another engineer says, his voice sharp with certainty. He points to a line on the blackboard. The trajectory is not ballistic. It is a level, powered, and maneuvering flight path. Look at this turn. A ballistic object cannot do that. They try other explanations, grasping at the straws of their existing knowledge. A nuclear-powered aircraft? A long-held but seemingly impossible dream? A new kind of rocket glider, launched from a mothership at extreme altitude? They try anything that allows them to maintain their faith in what their own understanding of metallurgy and brute force power can achieve. But nothing fits. The data from Victor's radar scope stubbornly, silently mocks their world. It is a set of facts that refuses to conform to their reality. The committee, unable to find a consensus, breaks apart into its natural factions. The men from the Ministry of Defense, the uniformed officers, see the problem in terms of threat and response. They want a weapon to counter this new machine, a taller ladder to reach this higher wall. The men from the GRU, the Military Intelligence Service, see it as an intelligence failure. They want to know what it is, who built it, and how they can steal its secrets. And the engineers, the men of TSAGI, they simply want answers. They are driven by a purer, more academic need to understand how such a thing is even possible. The entire debate is framed by the deeply ingrained Soviet approach to engineering. It has always been a machine-first philosophy. The solution to any problem is to make the tool bigger, heavier, and more powerful, to build a machine that is strong enough to survive the physical laws you're trying to force it to obey. It is a philosophy that has built tanks the size of small islands and rocket engines that breathe like hungry, fire-breathing animals. In their meetings, the language is always about thrust and toughness, about building engines that can simply outmuscle the laws of physics. But while the best minds in Moscow are wrestling with this philosophical and engineering crisis, a very different conversation is taking place across oceans and deserts. In the United States, in the secretive Skunk Works facility, the engineers have a philosophy that smells faintly of risk, of madness, and of a heretical embrace of the very problems the Soviets are trying to fight. Where the Soviet design philosophy seeks to overpower the hostile environment of high-speed flight, the Skunk Works philosophy is to invite that environment in and put it to work. The data that is a riddle to the men in TSAGI is, for the men in Burbank, California, a simple statement of purpose. They are not trying to break the laws of physics. They have simply found a cleverer, more elegant way to obey them. In a locked file drawer in Burbank, California, a collection of engineering memos tells the story of the ghost on Viktor Korolyov's radar scope. The notes, written in the spare, efficient, and often arrogant handwriting of the Skunk Works legendary chief, Kelly Johnson, are a testament to a radically different way of thinking about the problems of flight. Keep the spike moving, one note reads. Keep the flow steady, don't let the shockwave spit out. These are the private incantations of a new engineering religion. The young, impatient engineers who sit around his conference table delight in trying things that would make them appear mad to any orthodox aeronautical engineer. The great secret to the Blackbird's performance, the key that unlocks the riddle that is baffling the best minds in Moscow, is not some new, miraculous alloy or a secret, exotic fuel. It is a piece of brilliant and profoundly counterintuitive mechanical choreography. The Pratt Whitney J58 engine that powers the SR-71 begins its life as a reasonably normal, if exceptionally powerful, afterburning turbojet. The true innovation is what is mounted ahead of it. At the front of each massive engine nacelle is a long, sharp, movable cone, known as an inlet spike. This spike is the heart of the entire system. As the SR-71 takes off and climbs through the transonic and supersonic regimes, a sophisticated analog air data computer begins to slide the spike rearward with incredible precision. The geometry of the engine inlet is constantly, dynamically changing. This moving spike is designed to do one thing: to perfectly control the position of the powerful shockwave that forms at the front of the engine at supersonic speeds. By trapping this shockwave at the lip of the intake, the system converts the immense kinetic energy of the incoming air into massive static pressure. It is, in effect, using the aircraft's own forward speed to pre-compress the air before it even enters the engine. As the aircraft accelerates past Mach 2, this effect becomes so powerful that a significant portion of the hot, compressed air can be ducted away from the front of the engine core, bypassing the compressor stages entirely and piped directly into the afterburner section at the rear. The J58 becomes, in effect, a turbojet that slowly and seamlessly turns itself into a ramjet at speed. The faster it flies, the more air is bypassed, and the more the engine begins to function like a pure ramjet, generating the majority of its thrust from the continuous combustion in the afterburner. This is why the Blackbird is most efficient not at a leisurely cruising speed, but at its maximum velocity of over Mach 3. The faster it flies, the easier it gets. This mechanical concept is not just clever. To the Soviet engineers, it is deeply heretical. It violates their most fundamental axioms of engine design. For them, the immense heat generated by air friction at high speeds is an enemy, a destructive force that must be fought with stronger, more heat-resistant materials. For the Skunk Works engineers, that same heat is a problem to be coaxed into usefulness. It is a source of energy to be harnessed and managed, not simply endured. Back in Moscow and in the design bureaus scattered across the Soviet Union, technicians are painstakingly copying grainy spy satellite photographs and diagrams into their notebooks, using tight, meticulous hands. At TSAGI, they hold up a blurry photograph of the Blackbird's black, wedge-shaped form and whisper their theories. They are convinced the Americans must have discovered some new, secret alloy or perhaps a new, high-energy fuel. They believe the Blackbird's ability to survive skin temperatures of over 500 degrees Celsius must be the result of a material alchemy that is currently beyond their own industrial practice. While they are not entirely wrong, the Blackbird is indeed built from a revolutionary titanium alloy, they have missed the more profound philosophical point. The American solution is not just about better materials, it is about a better, more elegant idea. But the thread of the story that will ultimately prove more humiliating to the Soviet system than the technology itself is the simple, mundane reality of the supply chain. The KGB, the powerful state security service, begins to follow the paper trail, the way a patient dog follows a scent. Their agents uncover a complex chain of shell companies registered in neutral countries that have been purchasing large quantities of titanium ore from suppliers in Africa and Asia, and in some cases directly from the Soviet Union itself. The freight manifests list innocuous items, bicycle frames, industrial piping, commercial kitchenware. But the blonde, lightweight metal, labeled as something common, is being refined, packaged, and secretly flown to a defense contractor in California. The men in the quiet offices of the KGB in Moscow look at these manifests, and the truth hits them like a physical blow to the temple. The very plane that is mocking their defenses from the edge of space, the ghost that is making their most advanced interceptors obsolete, is being built with metal that was dug from their own soil. Their own natural resources are financing the instrument of their own humiliation. The heresy of the spike is one matter. The irony of the ore is a wound of a different and more personal kind. While the engineers at TCGI wrestled with the heresy of the spike, another quieter group of men in Moscow were confronting a different and in many ways more humiliating aspect of the Blackbird program. These were the men of the KGB, the powerful state security service, and their battlefield was not the sky, but the shadowy world of international commerce, of freight manifests, and of corporate ledgers. The task of uncovering the secrets of the SR-71 was one of the highest priorities for Soviet intelligence. But the Skunk Works, under the notoriously tight-fisted security of Kelly Johnson, was a black hole. Information did not leak out. So the KGB turned to a different method. They began to follow the materials, painstakingly tracing the global supply chain of the one exotic metal they knew the Americans must be using in vast quantities: titanium. Their agents, working under diplomatic and commercial cover in cities across Europe and Asia, began to follow the paper like patient dogs on a scent. They uncovered a complex and deliberately convoluted web of shell companies and third-party brokers. A company in Austria, ostensibly in the business of building chemical plants, would place a large order for titanium sponge from a supplier. That material would then be sold to another holding company in Switzerland, which would then resell it to a shipping firm in the Netherlands, which would finally arrange for its transport to the United States, where it would be delivered to a contractor with a bland, anonymous name. The freight manifests were works of fiction, listing the precious cargo as innocuous industrial goods, high-strength pipes for desalination plants, frames for racing bicycles, even specialized cookware for large institutional kitchens. It was a masterful exercise in commercial deception, designed to obscure the final destination and the true purpose of the material. But as the KGB analysts pieced together the fragments of information, a deeply unsettling picture began to emerge. They traced the origins of the titanium ore itself before it was ever processed. And that trace led them to a conclusion that was, for the proud and powerful men who ran the Soviet state, a source of profound and bitter humiliation. A significant portion of the high-grade titanium ore being used to build the world's most advanced spy plane was being sourced from the Soviet Union itself. The irony was crushing. The USSR was one of the world's largest producers of titanium, and in the complex, often indirect pathways of global trade, their own state-run mining enterprises were, unwittingly, selling this critical strategic material to the very entities that were funneling it to their greatest adversary. Their own earth was being mined to finance the machine that mocked them from the stratosphere. The humiliation of the ore was a quiet, internal wound, a secret failure that would never be admitted publicly, but which stung the pride of the Soviet leadership in Ann Arbor a way that no mere technological gap ever could. This discovery laid bare a fundamental weakness in the Soviet system. While they could command immense resources and achieve incredible feats of engineering through sheer brute force, they were often clumsy and slow-moving in the more subtle, interconnected world of the global economy. The Americans, with their fluid and often ruthless capitalist system, could manipulate that world with a speed and a creativity that the rigid, centralized Soviet bureaucracy could not match. The clandestine logistics and the creative accounting that built the Blackbird were as much a part of its success as its revolutionary engines. The costs of the Blackbird program for the Soviet Union were now beginning to multiply. And they were not just measured in pride. The repeated, untouchable overflights created a sense of fear and vulnerability within the Ministry of Defense that bordered on paranoia. The political leadership, embarrassed and fearful of this visible symbol of their own technological inferiority, began to demand a solution at any cost. The result was a decision to build a roof over the entire nation, a roof made of money. The air defense budgets, already enormous, began to swell to astronomical proportions. New surface-to-air missile sites, equipped with the latest, most powerful radars and missiles, began to multiply across the vast northern territories like a rash of bad weather. The entire posture of the Soviet air defenses began to change, shifting from a strategy of layered, rational deterrence to a frantic, patchwork attempt to plug a hole that seemed to be everywhere at once. Billions of rubles, resources that were desperately needed to build housing, to improve agriculture, or to modernize the nation's crumbling civilian infrastructure, were instead poured into the frozen soil of the North. The money was spent on yet more concrete bunkers, more radar installations, more missiles that would sit silently in their silos, waiting for a ghost they could not catch. The Cold War's brutal arithmetic was becoming starkly visible on the Soviet Union's own balance sheets. A handful of black, impossibly fast airplanes was forcing an entire superpower to divert a significant portion of its national treasure into a purely defensive and ultimately futile gesture. The Blackbird was not just a reconnaissance platform, it had become an economic weapon of incredible efficiency. It was a small fleet of aircraft that was slowly, silently helping to bankrupt an empire. As the economic and psychological costs of the Blackbird overflights mounted, the Soviet Ministry of Defense turned to its most prestigious design bureaus with a single, desperate mandate. Build an interceptor that could catch the ghost. The challenge was immense. It was not enough to build a fast aircraft. They needed to build a machine that could reach an extreme altitude, accelerate to a speed approaching Mach 3, and do so quickly enough to get into a firing position. This was not just an engineering problem, it was a race against a proven and untouchable adversary. The answer that emerged from the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau was the MiG-25 Foxbat. It was, in its own right, a breathtaking and terrifying machine, a perfect expression of the Soviet engineering philosophy of brute force. If the SR-71 was a rapier, a tool of elegant, sophisticated precision, the MiG-25 was a sledgehammer. It was not designed for finesse. It was designed with a single, anguished obsession. Get there faster, get there higher, and do it now. The Foxbat was essentially two enormous and incredibly powerful Tumansky R-15 engines with a small cockpit and a pair of wings attached. It was built not from lightweight titanium, which the Soviets could not yet machine on an industrial scale, but from a heavy and heat-resistant nickel-steel alloy. Its avionics were not the miniaturized, solid-state electronics of the West, but powerful and robust vacuum tubes which, while heavy and primitive, were more resistant to the electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear explosion. It was, in every sense, a machine designed to sprint after this new alien animal. But as its pilots would soon discover, they were sprinters trapped in a marathon world. The year is 1972. The location is the skies above the Sinai Peninsula, a place that would become a testing ground for so many of the Cold War's most advanced weapons. A Soviet pilot flying a specially modified MiG-25 as part of an advisory mission to Egypt is given his chance. His call sign is 831, his heart a mixture of pride in his machine and a weary apprehension. He climbs into a cockpit that smells of burnt fuel and adrenaline, knowing the rules that have been drilled into him. He has a maximum of 3 minutes at Mach 2.8. Anything longer, and the machine will begin to devour itself from the inside out. He launches into a sky that seems to grow thinner with each passing degree of altitude, a sky that feels less like air and more like a test. The vectors from the ground controllers feed directions into his headset. He accelerates, feeling the needles on his gauges, and the warning lights on his panel go from a calm, steady red to a reef of urgent, screaming crimson. The canopy shudders from the friction. The heat makes the thick polymer fog and glow at the edges. He climbs and climbs like a man running up an endless invisible stair. High above the sands of Nubia, he spots it. The Blackbird. It is both nearer and farther than physics should allow. It is a perfect, dark wedge, a shape that does not seem to fight the air so much as to sleep within it, utterly serene and untouchable. In that moment, the pilot makes a decision. He pushes beyond the rules, he overrides the safety detents on his throttles, his gloved fingers laboring against the mechanical stops that are there to save the machine from its own power. For 5 long minutes, he lives in the throttle's intoxicating lie, that a machine, if pushed hard enough, will keep obeying. The MiG's magnificent engines will not. The compressors, choking on the thin, superheated air, stall and surge. The turbine blades, pushed far beyond their thermal limits, begin to fuse and warp. The pilot can hear the sound of his engines going from a triumphant song to a harsh rattle, and then to a final, horrifying silence, a sound that lodges in the skull. With his engines flamed out, he has no choice but to put the dead stick fighter into a long, terrifying dive, hoping to restart them in the thicker, cooler air below. He makes it back to his base, but when the ground crew stares at the engines on the tarmac, it is as if they are looking at props from a cathedral fire. The intricate, finely machined pieces of metal now look like melted and misremembered ornaments. Moscow studies the wreckage of the engines the way a surgeon studies an unsuccessful graft, asking the same 2 questions over and over: what failed and why? The American diagrams and the spy photographs of the SR-71's unique engine inlets begin to line up with the evidence from the burned-out MiG. The Soviet engineers, brilliant men trapped within a system that cannot provide them with the right tools, begin to conspire to transfer this new knowledge, passing around grainy prints and secret reports like contraband. But they are faced with an insurmountable problem. It is not just the design of the Blackbird that is superior, it is the entire ecosystem of manufacturing tolerances and advanced metallurgy that supports it. The race to catch the ghost was, from the very beginning, a race they were destined to lose. The MiG-25 was a magnificent achievement, but it was a magnificent answer to the wrong question. It was a machine built to win a short, violent sprint. The Blackbird was a machine built to run an effortless marathon, a machine that had invited the storm inside and learned to thrive in it. The legacy of the Blackbird is not found in a list of combat statistics or missions flown. Its true impact was quieter, deeper, and far more profound. It was a weapon that didn't just outrun guns, it outran an entire way of thinking. This was not a small admission for the proud men who ran the Soviet military. It was a confession that one engineering culture, valuing a dangerous and expensive kind of precision and secrecy, had produced something that the other could imitate but never fully replicate. The Cold War's brutal arithmetic became starkly visible on the Soviet Union's own balance sheets. For every single SR-71 sortie that skirted their borders, the Soviets were forced to respond with a massive and costly military effort. They scrambled multiple interceptors, activated entire networks of ground-based radars, and kept surface-to-air missile crews on high alert for hours. The cost of a single Blackbird mission for the Americans was enormous, but the cost to the Soviets to defend against that single mission was exponentially higher. This created a massive, sustained economic drain, a strategic bleeding that the increasingly sclerotic Soviet economy could ill afford. The handful of black planes, through their very existence, were producing a defensive industry that was becoming an economic sinkhole. But there were also smaller, more personal, and less measurable aftershocks that rippled through the system. There was the quiet, simmering contempt that a young Soviet engineer might feel as he studied the diagrams of the Blackbird's inlet geometry, knowing in his heart that his own state-run factory could not produce that kind of precision on a mass scale. There was the bitter, unspoken irony that every GRU officer felt, knowing that the titanium mined from their own Earth had helped to armor the very plane that was watching their nation's most sensitive secrets. These were the small human scenes that would never make it into the official reports. A GRU officer sits at a dusty bureau under a dim lamp, a cigarette stub burning down to his fingers, tracing the labyrinthine ledgers of shell companies. He thinks not of grand strategy, but of the specific people who know how to refine titanium, and the faceless men who sign invoices in third-country banks. A young female engineer at the MiG Design Bureau pores over a diagram of the J58's inlet and bypass ducts. She silently draws a few simple sketches on the back of a napkin, asking a question that is deemed impractical and politically inconvenient by her superiors. She will be quietly demoted and re-interviewed, a small but telling casualty of a system that could not tolerate a certain kind of imaginative thinking. And a retired radar operator, a man who is now a train driver in the port city of Murmansk, still wakes in the middle of the night decades later and feels the phantom burr of that impossible ghost on his scope. By the late 1980s, other vectors of intelligence and money were beginning to converge. The era of the spy plane was slowly giving way to the era of the spy satellite. Satellites were, in the long run, cheaper to operate, politically cleaner in peacetime, and could provide a persistent global gaze that even the Blackbird could not match. Budgets shifted. The political winds changed. In 1990, the SR-71 fleet was retired. The odd, silent animals were placed in museums where they would no longer leak their special fuel onto the tarmac. The pilots in their silver pressure suits became relics of a bygone era, and the radar operators like Victor finally left their bunker lives for quieter, more ordinary rhythms. An air show in the early 1990s. The sky over a newly reunified Berlin is a brilliant, peaceful blue. On a patch of tarmac, strangers flock to see the strange, dangerous things from a past that now feels like a distant dream. A retired Soviet pilot, his face weathered and creased, stands near a MiG-25. A former SR-71 navigator, his hair now gray, stands near a Blackbird. Children press their noses to the plexiglass barriers. "Do you remember chasing it?" the American asks, as much to hear the old adversary's accent as the story itself. The Soviet pilot lets out a dry, rattling laugh. "Chasing it? We saw it, and we broke our best engines just trying to follow. We learned a lot about our limits from your machine." "It was never a sports race," the American replies, his voice quiet and reflective. "It was more like a demonstration of another way to think about force." They talk for a while about how a single machine had changed national policy, how a single metal had warped national budgets, how a simple spike and some bypass ducts had rewritten a small but crucial part of military strategy. They raise their paper cups of coffee, and for one small, peaceful hour, the sky belongs to the two of them, not to the vast, impersonal systems that had once pointed guns upward into it. The ghost on the scope remains a lesson. Technology is never only a technical matter. It is also political, economic, and deeply psychological. A few black jets had forced thousands of square kilometers of the Soviet Union to become a vast and expensive piece of defensive theater. They had reminded an entire generation of strategists that the sky itself can be a weapon, that ingenuity can be a form of economical terror, and that the simplest technical choices, where to place a spike, how to route a duct, can become the very hinge of history. Viktor Korolyov never sees the Blackbird again. He retires and teaches at a small technical school, where the young men and women born in a new and different country listen to his stories as if they were mythology. Sometimes, over tea, he will describe the day the green line on his radar stopped being routine. His hands, gnarled with age, will make the small, precise gestures that engineers make when they are trying to describe something too large for the page. "It was like a ghost," he says, the old familiar cadence returning to his voice. "A machine that did not belong in our world. And when it finally left the scope, I felt something open up inside me. It was not only fear, it was curiosity too. How could such a thing be made? Who would spend so much time and money to make something that completely changes the rules?" The question he asks is not only about metal or airflow. It is about what a nation will spend to keep its secrets, and what happens when one side decides to pay the immense price of audacity and the other pays the even greater price of a massed and ultimately futile defense. The impossible had arrived once on a quiet Tuesday morning in the far north, and no amount of thunder could ever unring that bell.